New Zealand has a rather unique railway system, running on 3-foot 6-inch gauge track due to the often rugged terrain, with isolated networks in the North and South Islands that are only linked by the inter-islander ferry. The network is owned and operated by KiwiRail, a state-owned enterprise that has existed since July 2008, and has been making an absolute fool of themselves in recent times. But I don't want to get into the management, economic or political side of things, because that is just a mess of baffling decisions and embarrassing incompetence that just gets my blood boiling. Instead, I will be discussing the various diesel locomotive types and one electric type that the company is currently using. I will not be covering the AM and Matangi electric multiple units, as they are not owned by KiwiRail. Although the DBR class did survive well into the KiwiRail era, I will not be discussing them either, as they had all been withdrawn by 2017. All I will say about the current situation is this. Why are they building a huge new freight complex out at Ruakura while simultaneously ditching customers and reducing the number of services throughout the country? Not to mention the painfully slow pace with the proposed Marsden Point project. One example of what I'm on about is the log traffic to Port Taranaki. It apparently goes by truck now, so they don't have any reason to keep running the S63 shunt. Never mind the increased numbers of trucks on State Highway 3, which are bound to make car drivers feel uneasy. We cannot rely solely on cars, trucks and buses forever, so stop surrendering to the roads! The oldest mainline locomotives on KiwiRail's books are the few surviving members of the DC class. Originally there were 85 of these things, rebuilt from EMD G12 or DA class locomotives between 1978 and 1983, having originally been built between 1961 and 1967. The most obvious change in the rebuild was the reduced height of the short hood, which was done to improve forward visibility for the driver. These locomotives have an A1A-A1A wheel arrangement, which means a pair of 3-axle bogies, but only 4 powered axles. The middle axle in each bogie is just there to help carry the weight. Power is provided by EMD 12-645E prime movers, which produce 1,650 horsepower. This is a slight improvement on the original 567 engines used in the DAs, which only churned out 1,425 horsepower. Whether it's due to being written off after accident damage, or just being deemed surplus to requirements, several DCs didn't last long enough to see the KiwiRail era, including the class leader 4006. Perhaps the most notable example is DC 4588, which was exported to Tasmania in 1998. She only ran in service there for 4 years before premature withdrawal in 2002. And a weird rebuild was started but never finished, which involved lowering the short hood even further. In the end, DC 4588 was never put back into service, and instead she was scrapped at East Tamar workshops in 2011. Due to several changes in operational requirements, some for the worse, and the arrival of the DL class between 2010 and 2023, there are very few DCs that are still in operation. Only around 7 in the South Island and 6 in the North Island. Based on what I saw when I was last in Christchurch, those DCs can typically be found in the Christchurch, Greymouth and Dunedin areas. Meanwhile, the Northerners are typically found shunting in Whangarei or Auckland, as well as hauling the M52 shunt from Hamilton to Hautapu and Waitoa. Between 2004 and 2015, at least 19 DCs were in use on commuter services in Auckland, running in push-pull formations with rebuilt ex-British Rail Mark II coaches. This group included the 5 Hutt rebuilt DCs, of which only 1 is still in operation today, and most of them were painted in the distinctive Max Blue livery. 4104, 4260, 4346, and 4818 were some of the rare exceptions, as those four were painted in KiwiRail colours. In 2020, KiwiRail sold 6 examples to the Australian company Martinus Rail, namely 4041, 4444, 4571, and 4692, with 4104 and 4634 only being sold as a source of spare parts. These locomotives were exported to the state of Queensland and used to haul works trains for new railway construction projects, and 2 of them have since returned to help with the City Rail Link project in Auckland. Out of the 13 or so DCs that are still in service today, 4 of them have still not been repainted in KiwiRail colours. The exceptions are DCs 4663, 4755, 4853, and 4951, and these are basically unofficial heritage units at this point. 4663 and 4951 are still in the old Max Blue livery, while 4755 retains Transrail Blue and 4853 retains Transrail Black. Interestingly, 4853 was historically based in the South Island, but was transferred up north around August 2021, and is still running in the North Island at the time of uploading. DC 4790 is also worth mentioning, because she was briefly a film star, having made 2 short cameos in the live-action Yogi Bear film from 2010. Back then she was still in the International Orange or Fruit Salad livery, and this was despite the fact that the film was set in the United States. More recently, the Netflix show Sweet Tooth has ended up in the same predicament. That's another show set in the USA, and yet it was all filmed in New Zealand, complete with scenes at Mission Bush and the Glenbrook Vintage Railway's Puke o Wadere sheds. There's one particular episode in which you can clearly see JA1267, the interior of the Puke o Wadere sheds, complete with some of the GVR's coaches, and most prominently A423. And neither JA1267 nor A423 have run under their own power since the early 1970s. On a personal note, and although I don't mean to boast, I've had 2 cab rides with DC 4790. The first was a run from Mount Maunganui to Sulphur Point and back in July 2011, returning on board DFB 7322, and the second was a short run at Waitoa in April 2019. Other DCs whose cabs I've visited include 4058, 4260, 4346, 4352, 4605, and 4634. 6 DCs are currently in preservation, which I find impressive and strange because KiwiRail is still using some of their classmates. The preserved examples are 4248, 4369, 4375, 4536, 4818, and 4876. The oldest example of the class, DC 4421, is now privately owned as well. She was originally built as DA 1441 in 1961, but I don't know if she's technically preserved or not. All I know about her current state is that she's in storage at Mission Bush, after being transferred up from Wellington in May 2022. The DFT/DFB class is a reasonably common mixed traffic design, found in both the North and South Islands. 30 of these things were built by General Motors of Canada, with the first batch of 20 arriving in 1979, and another batch of 10 joining the flock in 1981. Originally they were simply classified as the DF class, and used the same 1650 horsepower prime mover as the DCs. Between 1993 and around 1998, the whole class was rebuilt with turbochargers and redesignated as DFT. Since then, most of the class have received further modifications, including ditch lights across all 30 members and the installation of Bright Star engine management systems. The B in DFB refers to Bright Star. There was also a DFM subclass that had Maxi Trax wheel slip control, but that has since been removed from the few engines that received it, although DFT 7226 is still labelled as a DFM. 7145 was also labelled as a DFM into the KiwiRail era, but she has since been overhauled and redesignated as a DFB. In 2010, 4 of these locomotives were repainted in the Max Blue livery and modified to run push-pull commuter services in Auckland, working alongside the DCs with SA and SD coaches. The quartet comprised DFB 7010 and DFT 7104 with DFBs 7200 and 7348. 7010 only lasted 2 years in suburban service, as she started running freight trains again in 2012, while the other 3 kept going until full replacement by the AM electric multiple units in 2015. Currently, all 4 of these locomotives are still in active service, with 7104 now running in the South Island. Even after her overhaul, this locomotive is still designated as a DFT. These days, you'll find the DFs hauling freight services and all locomotive haul passenger services in the North Island, as well as additional freight workings down south. With a power output of at least 2,400 horsepower, they are fast locomotives with good acceleration, which makes them ideal for passenger service. One example of a service hauled by DFBs is Te Huia, which launched in April 2021 and runs from Hamilton to Auckland 6 days a week. Typically, it will be formed of 4 or 5 SR series coaches with a DFB on each end. DFT 7117 is the only example of her class that has been scrapped after a derailment. In 2011, she hit a landslide at Claverley on the main North Line, and was never repaired after the fact. Instead, she languished at Hutt workshops before eventually being scrapped in 2021. This leaves 29 examples still in operation today, although most of them have been overhauled to DFB specifications. On a personal note, and although this may sound absurd, I actually got to drive DFT 7077 in the yard at Mount Maunganui back in July 2010. Under supervision from an experienced driver, of course. Casual foamers would never be able to do this sort of thing these days. Back then, her and DC 4058 were frequently assigned to Kinleith services. Since then, the locomotive has been overhauled to DFB specifications, and now she is part of Te Huia's fleet. Other DFs whose cabs I've visited include the Class Leader 7008, as well as 7213, 7322, and 7335. I was quite surprised when, on a rainy Saturday in May 2022, 7213's driver actually let me have a look in the cab when she was idling at Wellington Station. Next is the DH class, of which only 6 were built in 1978, making them one of the rarest locomotive types in New Zealand. They are a variant of the General Electric U10B model, and the whole class is still in service today, with 4 based in Auckland and the other 2 typically based in Tauranga or Mount Maunganui. They used to be numbered from 900 to 905, but around 1979 they were given the TMS numbers 2816, 2822, 2839, 2845, 2851, and 2868. These things were originally built without shunts as refuges. In other words, those big extensions to the frame at each end with large steps, which allow the driver to safely stand outside the cab and drive the locomotive via a remote control. For a relatively small shunter, they can still move a sizable number of wagons at low speed, with their Caterpillar D398 prime movers producing 901 horsepower, and often chucking out a lot of exhaust in the process. Quite bizarrely, the DHs were sometimes used on Auckland commuter services in the early 1990s, prior to the arrival of ADK and ADL diesel multiple units from Western Australia. At least one of them even took an excursion train down to Huntly at one point, but they are now used exclusively on heavy shunting duties. Currently all but one of the DHs are in the KiwiRail livery, with 2839 being the sole exception, as she still wears the ex-Tollrail livery. The DL class is now the most common locomotive type on KiwiRail's roster. 73 of them were built by CRRC Dalian of China between 2010 and 2023, and currently they can be found exclusively in the North Island. Lucky us! With MTU prime movers producing 3,600 horsepower, these are the most powerful diesel locomotives in the country. The invasion of the DL class has seen the transfer of nearly the whole DX class to the South Island, except 2639, as she was scrapped in the late 1970s, as well as the gradual retirement of the remaining DC locomotives, though there are at least 6 DCs still running in the North Island as of April 2023. I remember that the 15-strong 2018 batch was ordered to replace the EF electric locomotives, but KiwiRail ended up making the sensible decision to keep the EFs in operation. Hell, they're even going through a very, very slow refurbishment program at the time of uploading. The DLs are unusual in that they have a cab at each end, while New Zealand diesels have historically had just one cab. The last time this country had a dual-cab diesel was with the English Electric DF, of which 10 examples were ordered in 1950, but they did not enter service until 1954. On the rare occasions when I've sat in a DL's cab, especially that time with the 9193 at National Park, I could certainly feel just how much power these things possess. I've never actually had a cab ride in a DL, so of course I can't comment on what they're like in motion. DLs whose cabs I've visited include the Class Leader, 9008, as well as 9066 and 9193. You can see these things in a wide variety of places, such as Whangarei, Auckland, Tauranga, Kawerau, New Plymouth, Napier, Palmerston North, and Wellington. As a northerner, I am very bored of seeing DLs all the time, but I suppose it's better than not having any train services at all, especially after the gradual pruning of the network in the last 30 years. and at least they sound decent enough when they're notching up, although the same cannot be said for their weirdly high-pitched horns. One of the oldest locomotive types still used by KiwiRail is the DSC class. These things have a long and somewhat complicated history, with 70 of them being built between 1959 and 1967. The first 18 were built in England by British Thomson Houston, while the remaining 52 were built by New Zealand Railways at their Hillside or Addington workshops. Originally they were numbered from 400 to 469, but were given new TMS numbers ranging from 2000 to 2759 in the late 1970s. When they were brand new they looked fairly plain and Spartan, and starting with tests on DSC 2406 in 1989, the class was equipped with shunters refuges. While at least 25 DSCs are still in KiwiRail service, those ones are all New Zealand-built examples, as all but one of the British-built examples have been scrapped. The only exception is DSC 2067, which is now working at an industrial complex near Oamaru. This is the only surviving DSC that has never received a shunters refuges. At the time of uploading, at least 4 DSCs are in preservation, which is quite bizarre given that KiwiRail are still using some of them. The preserved examples are DSCs 2238, 2257, 2584, and 2759. 2759 was the last DSC to be built, and is now based at the Gisborne City Vintage Railway, where she is used as a backup in case there's anything wrong with the WA class tank engine. Meanwhile, DSCs 2257 and 2584 are on the Waitara branch, and 2238 is owned by DBM Contracting and based at the Goldfields Railway in Waihi. Apparently DSC 2421 also works in industrial service at Lawnville, which is near Invercargill. As for where you'll find KiwiRail's active DSCs today, Wellington is a good place to start, as 2515 and 2665 are often used to shunt the Capital Connection, Wairarapa Connection, and Northern Explorer coaches between the station and Thorndon Yard. 2244 is normally based in Waitoa, though she usually stays confined to the yard and almost never goes out on the main line. She can't even lead trains on the main line, because she doesn't have ditch lights, and must be towed by another locomotive whenever she needs to go to Hamilton for maintenance. Theoretically, she could just shuttle back and forth between Waitoa and Morrinsville every now and then, but I don't know of any occasions when that has actually happened. Other places where you can find DSCs at work include Mission Bush, Auckland's Westfield Yard, the huge dairy factory at Whareroa, and the sidings in Te Maru, amongst other places. Quite bizarrely, 2678, which is painted in some special livery honouring a rugby team, spent around 6 years based in the Tauranga area, but has since gone back to her old home in the South Island. I always like watching a DSC in operation, although the Cummins NT855 prime movers can make a deafening growling noise when they're notching up. Perhaps the most common shunter on the system is the DSG class. "24 of these centre cab locomotives were built by Toshiba of Japan between 1981 and 1983. They are powered by Cummins KTA-1150L diesel engines, which produce a combined power output of 950 horsepower. The DSGs have a much more boxy appearance than the DSC, and unlike the DSC, these ones actually have radiator grilles at both ends. You can find DSGs working in several places throughout the country. These include, but are not limited to, Hamilton, KiwiRail's, New Plymouth, Palmerston North, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, and Edendale. Oddly enough, the class typically does not run in Auckland. Like the DH and DSC classes, the DSGs were retrofitted with shunters refuges in the 1990s. Most of the time they will be shunting wagons in yards like Middleton or KiwiRail, with the driver standing outside the cab and using a remote control. Sometimes DSGs will take freight trains a short distance along the main line, such as the Y33 shunt from Invercargill to Bluff, or occasional shunts from Middleton to Littleton. One other place I remember seeing DSGs on the main line was in Hawke's Bay, where they were used on the U4 and U6 shunts from Napier to Hastings. On a personal note, in August 2010 I had a cab ride with DSG 3196 at Sulphur Point. Back then she was still in the Transrail blue livery, and I remember seeing at least 5 DSGs pottering around the Bay of Plenty at that time, namely 3020, 3168, 3196, 3249, and 3304. Around 2017 and into 2018, DSG 3196 was still based in Mount Maunganui, but she has since been transferred to the South Island, and 3249 is the only one out of the aforementioned quintet that still runs in the Bay of Plenty. The DSJ class is aesthetically similar to the DSG, but has a few major differences. Only 5 of these things were built by Toshiba between 1983 and 1985, with 4004 being assembled in Japan, and the remaining 4 being shipped to New Zealand in pieces and assembled at Addington Workshops in Christchurch. These locomotives only have one prime mover, but it's the same Cummins KTA-1150L design used in the DSG. The The DSJ has a noticeably shorter frame than the DSG, complete with an off-centre cab and a radiator grille at only one end. Only 4 of these unusual shunters are still in service, as the class leader accidentally went swimming in Picton back in September 2021. 2 of the surviving DSJs, 4017 and 4045, are in the KiwiRail livery, while 4032 and 4060 retain the old toll rail livery, albeit with KiwiRail colours, and a differently coloured cab in 4032's case. Down in the South Island, you'll find the General Electric built DX class, of which 49 examples were built between 1972 and 1976, to GE's standard U26C design. Incredibly, the class is still going strong when the youngest example, DXC 5517, is 47 years old, and the class leader, DXB 5016, is 51 years old. Prior to the arrival of the DL class from 2010 onwards, the DXs were still a reasonably common sight in the North Island. These days, you'll be lucky to just see a DX in Wellington when it's due for overhaul. These locomotives are powered by GE 7FDL-12 prime movers, with an original power output of 2,750 horsepower. Their original numbers were in the 2600 series, reflecting NZR's tradition of numbering diesel locomotives based on their power output. However, none of these locomotives are still in the original DX specification today, as all but one of them have been modified or rebuilt as either the DXB, DXC, or DXR subclasses. The last one to retain the basic DX designation was 5483. For the longest time, DX 2639 was the only example of her class to have been withdrawn from service, as this was due to her being damaged beyond repair in a collision at Newmarket in 1977. 2639 was the only DX that never received a TMS number. DX 5045 is now running as DXC 5520. She was rebuilt and renumbered after a nasty accident at Te Wedra on the Stratford to Okahukura line in 2002. And from what I understand, the reason why she was renumbered was out of respect for the driver, who did not survive the crash. The same thing happened with DFT 7254, which is now going as DFB 7348. The DXC subclass, of which there are 32 examples, have distinctive air intakes or chutes on both sides of the locomotive. This is to allow her to safely haul freight trains, or the Transalpine passenger train, through the 8.5 km long Aotearoa tunnel, which is on a 1 in 33 uphill grade towards Arthur's Pass. This variant came about in the late 1990s, when diesels were taking over banking duties from the EO class electric locomotives. Initially opening with a tunnel in 1923, the electrified section from Aotearoa to Arthur's Pass had the wires pulled down in 1997. The DXRs are quite the bizarre sort, as there are only 2 of them in existence. In 1993, DX 5362 was rebuilt as DXR 8007, and the reason why they chose 5362 specifically is because she had serious frame damage at the time. She received a completely new long hood, larger fuel tank, and a brand new universal cab, whose design was based on feedback from engine drivers. The new cab was popular amongst crews, and the plan was to put this cab on all future rebuilds. hence the use of the word universal. This plan advanced so far that DC 4496 was even stripped down in preparation for a rebuild with this new cab. But towards the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s, New Zealand's railway system was in a very poor financial state, not to mention the severely run down state of the infrastructure, so all unnecessary spending was done away with, leaving DXR 8007 as a strange one-off. Actually, I dread to think how bad DC 4496 would have looked if she had ever been put back together and fitted with the universal cab. If anything, it would probably look about as bad as what Tasrail tried to do to DC 4588. DX 5235 was involved in a head-on collision with another DX in 2000. After sitting in storage for a few years, Tollrail decided to rebuild her as the second DXR, and in 2005 she left Hut Workshops under her new identity of DXR 8022. 8007 was later modified to have the same boxy cab as 8022, which looks very different from the original design. In the early 2010s, the DXRs were a common sight in the Bay of Plenty, but they have since been transferred to the South Island. At the time of uploading, 8007 is often used to haul the Coastal Pacific passenger train, while 8022 is busy on freight services to Picton or Lyttelton. Around 2018, KiwiRail announced a program to rebuild at least 15 DXC locomotives as the new DXE subclass, with the rebuilds set to feature updated 3,300 horsepower prime movers with electronic fuel injection, as well as new long hoods, basically just the DXR design with air intakes, as well as higher capacity fuel tanks, strengthened underframes, and full rewiring, amongst many other alterations. The idea was that these rebuilds would extend the DXC's working life by at least 20 years. And a DXC 5500 was even taken out of service and sent to Hut Workshops to become the prototype for this project. But the cost of rebuilding ended up exceeding the cost of buying new locomotives. What a surprise. In the end, 5500 was never put back together, and what remains of her is still in storage at Hut Workshops, leaving 47 DXs still in operation. By the time the DXE program was cancelled, KiwiRail had already ordered at least 4 EFI prime movers from General Electric, so they decided to just install these in 4 of the DXCs while retaining their classification. The first one to be upgraded was 5212, and the other 3 that have since received the EFI upgrade are 5454, 5391, and 5039, with the overhauls taking place between 2020 and July 2022. As for the DXB subclass, of which there are at least 13 examples, this is a much simpler modification with the Brightstar engine management system installed, hence the B in DXB. There aren't any major visual differences between the original DX and modified DXB subclasses, though it does look odd seeing a DXB double-heading with a DXC. On a personal note, I have a short story relating to DXB 5114 that I want to share. One time in October 2020, my family was driving through Dannevirke when we noticed 5114 waiting in the loop, and I think she was going back towards Palmerston North. We went over to have a quick butcher's, and the driver was kind enough to let us have a look in the cab. Besides 5114, other DXs whose cabs I remember visiting included 5080, 5120, and 8022. The EF class is the only type of electric locomotive that still runs revenue-earning services in New Zealand. 22 of these absolute units were built by Brush Traction of Loughborough, England, and entered service in 1988. They were built specifically for the Hamilton to Palmerston North section of the North Island main trunk, which is the most demanding section of the line. It is electrified with overhead wires at 25,000 volts alternating current, the same system that would eventually go on to be used in Auckland. At 4,000 horsepower, the EF is New Zealand's most powerful locomotive. The design features an unusual bow wheel arrangement, and weirdly, it served as the basis for the Eurotunnel Class 9 in the Channel Tunnel. Interestingly, the EFs were the first Kiwi locomotives to have ditch lights, a feature that is now standard across the whole system. The class has had a bit of a rough history, with EFs 30036 and 30088 being written off and scrapped after a washout near Oeo in 1991, while 3 more were withdrawn in the early 2000s and have never returned into service. More recently, and this is getting into the KiwiRail era, 3111, 3157 and 3249 were also withdrawn. In 3157's case, it's because she caught fire in 2015. While 3111 apparently required an air compressor change, and I don't know what was wrong with 3249. And apparently, EF's 3128 and 3186 were scrapped in 2021. Around 2016, KiwiRail had unpopular plans to get rid of the electrics altogether. Reducing emissions apparently wasn't important, while still keeping the overhead wires in place. I wasn't the only one who was very unhappy with that decision. But common sense and increased government funding resulted in the EFs remaining in service, with the refurbishment program starting in 2019. 4 years later, only 2 EF refurbishments have been completed, on 3163 and 3226, and most of the few EFs that are still going retain the old International Orange or Transrail Black liveries. In June 2022, DL 9410 towed EFs 3232, 3071, 3059 and 3094 down to Wellington for eventual refurbishment. Incredibly, the class leader, EF 30007, is still running in her original livery, and now looks very shabby after 35 years of service. The class has been dogged with reliability issues in recent times, and considering how rare they are, it's always nice to see an EF or two when you get the chance. On extremely rare occasions, they are towed dead up to Auckland's Westfield Yard for return on the wheel lathe. At the time of uploading, only around 5 EFs are currently in active service, while the refurbished 3163 and 3226 seem to be about as reliable as the Class 17. Perhaps the most unusual and obscure class on KiwiRail's books is the TR class, with TR being a blanket designation applied to numerous different 040 shunting tractor designs built by various companies. The few examples that are still in service were built domestically by A&G Price of Thames or Hillside Workshops of Dunedin, while others were built by Hitachi of Japan. The Price TRs were built between 1956 and 1962, while the Hitachi TRs were built in 1969. The Hillside TRs are the youngest members of the class, although that's not saying much since they were built between 1973 and 1978, so the oldest one is now 50 years old. A sizable number of TRs are now in preservation, including some that survived into the KiwiRail era. 730 is based at the Western Springs Railway in Auckland, while 367, 436 and 459 can be found at the Bush Tramway Club near Huntly. TR 701 was formerly the shunter at the now closed Pandora Depot in Napier, but she is now in the care of the Fielding and District Steam Rail Society, and here's hoping that Sam and the other volunteers are taking good care of her. TR 603 was still used by KiwiRail as a shunter in Dunedin until as recently as 2021, but now she is in the hands of the Ocean Beach Railway. Surprisingly, some of the Hillside TRs have even been repainted in KiwiRail colours, but none of the Price or Hitachi examples have ever received the livery. These locomotives are very hard to find, but in the last few years I've briefly seen them in Hamilton, Martin, Palmerston North, and Wellington. 3 Hillside TRs are also in preservation. namely 937 at Maymorn, 943 at the Ferrymead Railway, and 966 in Dargaville. Back in 2016, I remember seeing TR 914 at Eltham when they actually used to have a shunter based there. Of course, the yard is now disused, and the only regular train that goes all the way to New Plymouth just passes by without stopping. Quite a sad state of affairs if you ask me.